2026 meeting of the Planning Board. Please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call, please.
Member Izzy?
Here.
Member Perry?
Here.
Chair Hubbard?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Okay, does anyone have changes to today's agenda? Okay, can I please have a motion to approve the May 18th, 2026 agenda?
I motion that we approve the May 18th, the agenda. Yes.
I'll second.
Roll call, please.
Member Perry?
Yes.
Member Izzy?
Yes.
Chair Hubbard?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Do we have any do we have any audience comments?
No.
Okay. I will move to item 3, which is approval of the April 20, 2026 minutes. Are there any changes to those?
No.
Okay. Roll call, please. Or motion to approve those minutes as written.
I motion we approve the April 20th minutes as written.
I'll second.
Thank you. Member Izzy?
Yes.
Member Perry?
Yes.
Chair Hubbard?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. I have no action items today, so we will move on to 5A discussion items. The first one is the sign ordinance.
Good afternoon. This was a board requested item from last meeting. I just have a very brief presentation just to get us up to speed. Two of the members present today probably remember this well because we just majorly amended our sign ordinance last summer. If we could pull the PowerPoint up, please.
And so this is what you sent was the amended one that's not approved or the approved one?
That is the amended.
Okay.
Approved.
Okay.
Could we pull that PowerPoint up, please? So I'd sent some examples of current code compliant signs out. I have those slides to reference if you would like, but we did majorly amend our sign code in the summer of last year. The major driving force for this originally was to comply with Reed versus the Town of Gilbert. That was a 2015 landmark Supreme Court case. There are a couple other cases that have come in the wake of that. That really the major applicable impact on our sign code was to remove the content-based regulations. As you're probably well aware, government speech is, or government limitation of viewpoint-based speech is very limited, but this case came out and said, in terms of applicability to sign codes, that the city also cannot differentiate based on content. For example, we previously had regulations that allowed for different size signs and signs to be located in different areas if they were, if they pertain to a real estate matter compared to a construction project. We took out that reference. We have now time-based signs. We have place-based signs. So are they appropriate in a certain area based on the height, based on the square footage, the type of illumination, and so on. And then manner, how is the manner of the message delivered? Is it through an LED sign? Is it through a standard channel letter sign or so on? Our second intent was to provide uniformity between zoning districts along Gulf Boulevard and Blind Pass Road. Prior to that, we had over 12 different sign districts. There were often very minute differences between districts. We flattened those down to 4 districts. There's now much more uniformity between the types of signs that are allowed in the various zoning categories throughout the city. We do differentiate between Paso Grill and Southern Gulf Boulevard, which is separate from the downtown area, which is separate from the more general commercial areas. But those are really the distinctions that we currently make in our sign code. Initially, our plan was to pass stricter sign compliance requirements for nonconforming signs. We have a large number of nonconforming signs in the city. Many of them are 2-3 times the size of what we would allow today under the sign code. That was our intent. It did make it to City Commission. In the interim between it going to Planning Board and the City Commission, Senate Bill 180 was passed. That prohibits any kind of stricter regulations, and that would have fallen under that, even from a development standpoint. So we did remove that. It is something that we can certainly discuss, having stricter regulations related to compliance for nonconforming signs, but that can only be after the conclusion of Senate Bill 180. We expect that to be in October of next year. So here are some recent examples of signs, post-storm and pre-storm, that have been made compliant with the city sign ordinance. This is the Remax sign. It really took some serious damage in the storm. The pole sign has been replaced with the new non-conforming sign. It's 50 square feet in sign area, 8 feet in height. That complies with our current standards. It has the landscape setting, and it's colored to look like the building. Those are some of the current requirements. Looking at the former Baycare sign, again, a pole sign, it was too tall, it was too large. They now have a new non-conforming sign. Baycare is no longer present, but the location, the square footage, height, those are all compliant with the current sign code. Looking at the Walgreens sign, similar arrangement, formerly a pole sign. They use the same base. They have not installed the landscaping yet, but it does meet the height, it does meet the area limitations based on our current code. Here's one from a few years back. That was prior to the sign code amendments last year. This was a pole sign for the Chick-fil-A. At the time, they required a variance for both sign square footage and height. One of the changes that was made with the sign code amendments last year was to allow for a little bit higher of a height in the zoning district. They now comply with the height limitation for that sign at 12 feet tall. So this is a sign that was pre-current sign code, but does still comply with the current sign regulations. And this is a unique one. We've only seen one of these so far. This is the Postcard Inn on the Beach sign. It was recently reinstalled as the Loose, the rebranding of that hotel. This sign exceeds the height allowed. It exceeds the square footage allowed. However, in reviewing with the City Commission last year, they did want to allow for those signs that were not substantially damaged, that were associated with properties that were undergoing restoration, provided that they applied for permits for restoration within a set period of time. They kept those current while the sign was being restored. And again, when the sign was not destroyed or requested to exceed the height or the square footage of what was in place previously, they did allow for those signs to be reinstalled, when they're associated with a catastrophic event. So I don't have a photo of the Loose's current sign, but that has been reinstalled. It's effectively the same sign that was there previously. It's a little bit shorter, but the square footage of the sign has not increased. So this was a special circumstance. It was something that was allowed based on those sign code amendments and was not in place prior to the amendments last year. So with that, I just wanted to provide some examples, some background to how we got to the sign code as it exists today. Happy to answer any questions.
I have a few. So, can you give me a list, not now, you don't have to do it now, but unless you have a list, but of the restrictions that you removed because of Senate Bill 180? You know, what were the things that were going to be in it that are now not there?
So the major change we were going to make, we currently have a non-conforming sign standard of 50% depreciated value, just like you would have with a home. If any kind of maintenance or elective restoration of that sign or damage restoration were to occur that exceeds 50% based on the current sign code, that sign needs to be brought into compliance with the current sign code. Our proposal was to reduce that down to 25%. A lot of the restoration that we see falls into the 30 to 45% range based on the scope of work that they're undertaking. With a sign, there's a lot more ability to drop certain maintenance requirements and so on. Our intent was to lower that threshold to require those signs to be brought into conformity. We were also not proposing what you see on the screen, the allowance to restore signs. That had been a request that had been made once the sign amendments were underway. But that was our intent. We made things a little bit more permissive, like I brought up with the Chick-fil-A sign. The height limitation went from 8 feet to 12 feet. Square footage didn't change, but the height was allowed to be a little bit taller. The trade-off with that would have been for those signs that are very tall, that are well over the square footage we allow based on our current sign code. They were going to have a lower threshold to come into compliance with that standard. We unfortunately had to take that out because of Senate Bill 180. That had been something that both this board and the commission had wanted included. We just didn't have the ability to pass it.
Was there ever any discussion about pole signs in general being, removed or not being allowed?
We don't currently allow for pole signs, so that would, again, this one being an exception. Under the current code, we would not allow for pole signs.
I thought I saw that. I must not have read that correctly then. So businesses that are there that currently have a pole sign, let's just pick one, doesn't matter. And I'm not picking on anyone, I'm focused on pole sign, right? For safety, for one, right, especially, that's the main thing. But let's say a tall one like the Waffle House. Do they ever have to remove that and get in conformance with what are they called, monument signs? Is that that's what we're calling them?
Correct. We don't currently have an amortization schedule for those. We do for LED signs, so that's coming up. But for those, we gave about a 10-year lead on requiring them to come into compliance. I think the compliance deadline is late next year, but we don't currently have a set date that they need to bring their sign into compliance.
Okay. So there is, or there, I was confused by that last statement. So we have a deadline for people to,
So the only compliance deadline that we have is for LED signs, electronic message board signs. We don't have any based on the height, the type of sign, other than LEDs. Area, we don't have a certain deadline for them to come to compliance. It's based on the maintenance cost for the sign or the damage the sign sustains.
okay. Is that something when Senate Bill 180, when we're not under that anymore, is that something we could potentially look at?
I think we could definitely look at that. I think we had a couple proposals that would have made the sign code a little bit stricter. It was more of a trade-off at the time, but I think we can certainly look at that.
Yeah, because we're never going to get to any, you said it, the uniformity, right? I'm not sure what, again, this goes back to a lot of things that I'm confused with on the city, because there's no vision for a lot of things that we're doing. But if I were to ask, what is the vision for the uniformity? What does that mean to us in the city, currently? What does that mean? Someone should be able to say, well, it means, hey, we really only want, for all the reasons, safety, et cetera, right? We only want monument-style signs. We don't want lighted signs. We don't want backlit signs. We don't want LED, obviously. So we've done something there. And we don't want this. So the uniformity that we want in the city is going to be this. And then we can decide, what does it take to get there? So I think when Senate Bill 180 kind of expires or gives us more permissions to do things, I think we need to be ready for that. But it's hard when there's not a real vision. I mean, I could tell you what I think, in general we should do based on other cities. Every time I go to a city, ever since I moved here and tried to get involved with a little bit of what's going on with our city, every city I go to now, I look around and say, okay, how come ours looks this way, theirs looks that way, whether it's sidewalks, signs, or whatever, right? But I'm not an expert, I'm not a city manager, so how do we get to a place signage-wise that we want to go to, uniformity or whatever we're getting to? It would really be nice if we could define that as well, right? What is it that's acceptable for us when you drive up and down Gulf Boulevard from a safety perspective, from a aesthetics perspective and all that? What is it that we want this drag to look like in 5-10 years? I don't even know, and so let's say we came up with something, we go through all this gyration. How long of a time frame, or how short of a time frame really is what I should say, without really, what's reasonable without putting too much stress on businesses too, right? We can't say overnight tear everything down and build everything. That's not fair, right? So what is the kind of the norm in this kind of process? Because obviously there's an appetite to change something, right? That started before the storm. What is the time frame that we need to get to where we want to go? How does that normally work?
Brandon, if you could kind of give it a little background, because we did have a consultant that we had reached out to, and I think that was, I don't know in what year we started with the sign code ordinance, or the sign change. So it does take a number of years, and we did have a consultant, and I'm just trying to super sleuth as I'm sitting here, but it did take some time. We had some community engagement, went to commission, for an overall, like a big overhaul of our sign code. Did it come out to the way we want it? Not necessarily, because we did have some restrictions placed on us. But from what I can recall, going to commission, we did kind of put a purpose and a sense in there as far as what they wanted to see. And I don't know really the sense that we got out of that as far as like designer signs or monument signs, other than bringing things a little smaller and closer to the ground.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Did it produce design standards, or did it just produce, here's what we definitely don't want for these reasons, so don't do this, but not, we'd really like you to make it look this way?
I don't think we got a real clear sense of direction on that.
So it sounds like to me, the city, I think we all, the funny thing about St. Pete Beach, we all kind of want the same thing. We just argue the heck out of how to get there, We can't seem to figure out how to bring the thoughts together and the people together to get to the product we want or to the vision we want, right? Sounds like there's an appetite in this city, based on the work you've already done, to have a better signage experience as you come into this town for safety and other reasons. Do we need to go back now, and because we're going to get some relief and we can put some of these other restrictions back in place that were already agreed upon, but we had to back off of them, just to go back to that kind of starting point and go, okay, this is, if we're able to do this is what this signage ordinance would look like. We would put these other things back in place. Is there anything else that we want to put in place and entertain? I could come up with a lot of them. This is not the time to do that, I don't think. But I'd be happy to be part of that effort. I just want to see. You've heard me voice my frustration many times about we don't get things done because we don't have the first step, which is the vision, right? What is that vision of what we want it to look like? And then we can get in with a work group or whatever we're going to do to figure out how to get there, right? And help craft the wording to get there. So I know we got problems with the pole signs that are still there, and I would like to see them come down as soon as possible. So if they're no longer, so we would have to do the same thing you did with LED, right? By this whatever time, you have to get rid of them.
Correct.
We got to start doing some of that stuff. So how can we get there from here? Is what I'm asking. I don't want.
Most of the sign codes around the country have what they call amortization period. And there's tax amortization that the IRS has, which is 5 years, but you can also write off your sign in 1 year if you want to do that. But the amortization for sign codes is more like a return on investment, or recover the use of your sign, and then when you update your sign, you go to the new code. They go anywhere from less than a year. Most of them are 3 years or 5 years. There's some that go all the way to 15, but that's only like 2 out of 117. When the American Planning Association looked at it, they were usually 3 years or 5 years. And there were some that were less than 1, but not very many, like 10 out of 100.
Right.
So you kind of want to figure out how much it costs for a pole sign, how long has it been there already, have they gotten the lifetime useful life use out of it? Is it time to trade in now for a new sign? And I think for the LEDs we give 5 years.
Well, it was originally 10, but to your point, the city has not allowed pole signs except one's granted a variance for, I believe, 20 years now. So, based on a 30-year usable life for a, it's
It's been there for a long time now.
And that's another one of my points is, we're 20 years from now, the Gulf Boulevard is going to look the same unless we start doing some things and putting some things in place, right? There's other cities out there that you can drive through, and you look around and you go, wow, this looks really great. And there's no danger, of course, of a pole sign falling on your head during a hurricane. But and just in general, the way it looks is just fantastic. You drive through and you go, wow, you know, this could be us, right? Or something like this. But again, I don't know what else to say from this point other than I would really like us to do an effort on this, but I'm not a commissioner, right? I can't dictate to any of you any of this. I just, what's the next best step to try to at least fulfill what was the appetite, was the restrictions that were taken away? You know, how do we go? Where do we go from here? And what can I do to help, you know, really?
So I think the first step would be to engage this board on the 2025 sign code to see if it's still in line with what your intent is, what you would like it to say. We did engage the city commission back in 2024 on what became the 2025 amendments, and at the time they did want to see uniformity in color between the signs and the building, but they did not want uniformity in design of signs across the city. They also didn't necessarily want there to be a requirement for the same materials of the sign or the sign base to match the building. So we might see uniformity, whatever that takes shape as, in terms of getting rid of the pole signs, making them compliant with the RE/MAX, with the Chick-fil-A signs that you saw on those slides. But if this board wanted more than that, if the city commission wanted more than that, that was not the direction we got at the time. Granted, that was, I believe, a completely different commission, or potentially just one commissioner still. So there might be a different direction today. But we have some time. We have 15 months now, so we can definitely work on the amortization is really just picking a timetable that we think works for everybody. I think, to the city attorney's point, most of the pole signs, with the exception of a handful, have been there for 15 to 20 years at least. So, you know, I think we'd face less of an uphill battle than if they were put in last year. So that might be a little bit easier to achieve. In terms of uniformity, we're just going to have to define what that means.
Yeah, and I'll
We do
stop.
have a couple historic signs too, that Brandon and I worked on.
We do. We have the
Some
The
hotel
Bon Air.
Bon Air,
particular ones.
the Keystone Hotel, Motel. So
I would recommend, instead of hiring yet another consulting firm to give us yet more information we don't seem to do much with, is find a cast of volunteers from the city to be your consulting firm on this, right? You use the people here who have an interest in this, who would really, you know, pull their sleeves up and go investigate how maybe other cities are doing. You know, just, I think there's an appetite, and it would help pull the community together too, as well. Something like this is big. It's huge. It's how, you know, it could shape the way our whole city looks for the next, you know, 50 years if we do whatever we do. Anyway, but I do thank you for bringing this up.
Brandon, can you refresh my memory on what triggers extensions of SB 180? Is it still hurricane track within 100 miles?
I think it's hurricane landfall within 100. Is that?
Well, you have Senate Bill 180 has two different sections, and one of them dealt with the Milton and Helene, and those will expire in 2027. But then there's another provision that if there's another hurricane, it's for 1 year after that hurricane. And I can look up, but I think it's I'll see if it's 100 miles from landfall. But it might be where they've named a state of emergencies. Let me take a look at it, and I'll let you know.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
Could be in
hopefully,
perpetuity.
yeah, hopefully we never have that happen again. But I feel like one of the bills used language of just the track being predicted to come through here was sufficient to extend the moratorium, but
It'll be a new one. It would be an extension to be a new one based on a new storm.
Okay. Are there any other triggers that require sign replacement? Like if the property is demolished and...
Yes, if the property is demolished, if it's redeveloped, all the signs on the property need to come into compliance. If it's abandoned, so if a business goes out of business for a certain period of time, now that's told based on the storms, but if 5 years from now a building is still vacant and it has a pole sign that's too tall, if the state of emergency has expired, we would be able to require them to come into compliance.
Okay.
Impacted local government is within 100 miles of the track of a storm declared to be a hurricane by the National Hurricane Center, while the storm was categorized as a hurricane.
So that is just the track then. It doesn't even have to hit.
If it peters out, then it doesn't. But while it's a hurricane, 100 miles from
Okay.
that any county, and all the cities within that county,
Okay. Yeah.
within 100 miles of the track.
So we might be stuck with these signs for a bit.
Yes.
Yeah, but true.
If you have a window of opportunity, seize it, because it may not be there forever.
You won't be able to seize it if you're not ready.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have to have a document ready to go. It's almost like you had the other sign ordinance on the shelf that the things you had to take out of it, the restrictions. You'd have another one sitting here ready to go as soon as we're able. But if we don't do the work now,
We won't get it done.
by the time we start the work and then a year later do it, then a storm comes, you're going to miss the opportunity. And so this, the next one I was going to ask you about was to see if we can get some more info on is the sidewalk thing. Because I know we were heading in the right direction regarding sidewalks, but I don't know if that got waylaid as well. But those very important safety-related things for our city, we have to be ready. Those are infrastructure things that just can't keep getting kicked down the road, Anyway.
All right. Anything else? No? Okay. We'll move to discussion item 5B, updates to seawall ordinance. I know Member Perry has a presentation. What order?
Brandon has one. Brandon.
Oh, okay. All right.
Must be Luke.
Who's first?
Good afternoon, everybody. Luke Curtis, building official for the city of St. Pete Beach. We can get the presentation up on screens. Perfect, thank you. So, we were tasked with coming up with some changes to our seawall ordinance to help clarify and kind of streamline the approval process, if you will. We don't have a whole lot of people that are looking for changes or variations from the elevation requirement, but when they do for certain hardships, sometimes it can get complicated, and the code needed a little bit of tweaking. So what we did is we went in and we looked at the variance criteria that we have currently in our code. And there's 5 basic criteria that it has. And I say basic, but some of them are a little bit more entailed. So the first one is there are special conditions of the upland subject property, existing upland structures or buildings, or vested and permittable upland structures or buildings which the applicant has taken reasonable investment-backed steps to construct, for which the application of the subject standard will present a hardship. So if the seawall being elevated to a certain point poses a hazard to that, then that was that one step, one condition. The second one is the hardship is not predominantly financial in nature. And that's typical of any kind of variance from codes that we have, is just because of the financial aspect of it is not a reason for an application or an approval of a variance. The third point, application of the subject standard will imperil the subject or a neighboring property. So obviously, any work that we do, we don't want to negatively impact our adjacent properties. The fourth point gets a little bit more detailed. The hardship does not result from the upland property owner's unwillingness to modify the site to accommodate retention or detention of a 25-year, 24-hour storm, or such modification would itself rise to the level of a hardship that deprives the applicant reasonable use of the land, structure, or building. So when we're looking at stormwater, and if there is a means to, or well, if the claim is elevating a seawall is going to create, for the lack of a better term, a backflow or pooling of rainwater, then what the code is looking for is to redirect that rainwater, direct it to back to the street so that it can go through the storm drain system. And so that's what this is talking to in this section here. So, for example, let's just say the elevating a seawall creates a pooling area. The intent is, well, we could do a couple things. We could create swales on either side or one side of a property to redirect that stormwater back to the street. Or we could have a retention or detention pond or area, which could be, you think of on a small scale, a French drain can be used to accommodate rainwater so that it's not just sitting on top. And then we get down to the fifth point. The variance requested is the minimum necessary to reasonably mitigate the peril that the application of the subject standard would otherwise cause. So again, what will be the minimum elevation without causing this peril? So with these points in mind, this is what brought up the questions as far as, well, how can we be more refined in this? How can we alleviate that requirement of the 5-foot elevation where warranted? So we needed to clarify that. And so some of the points that we came up with that when we addressed this with the commission was just right here. So looking at adding language to the codes to require caps on seawalls to be designed for future upgrades to the required height. So in those instances where the seawall is not at the 5-foot elevation, they are lower, but they're designed so that they could be accommodating of an elevation or adding to it at a later date. The hardship variance would be granted if the cost to accommodate stormwater exceeds 20% of the value of the primary structure. So this is looking at trying to set a threshold. So just like we have the 50% rule for substantial damage, if it tips that threshold, then, I'm sorry, that's a little backwards looking at it, but by setting a threshold, it helps to identify what is too much. So in this case, setting a threshold of, say, 20% of the value of the building. If it exceeds that, then it's excessive and they wouldn't be required to do that. But if it's under that, so going back to the example of swales or retention or detention, or maybe even something as simple as we have some properties that have 100% impervious area on the lot. So we have limitations on how much impervious area, because that's just going to, in those scenarios, the rainwater is just going to sheet off the property and to the street or wherever. But it might mean in some instances the property would need to be made conforming to that if that's what's causing an issue. And then revising the criteria for administrative relief, setting a minimum elevation of 4 feet NAVD. So in the instances where we do allow for seawall to be lower than the standard, setting at least that minimum of 4 feet. And then lastly, new construction to require seawall to be made conforming. So in the case where we have a brand new home that's conforming with all the regulations, the property itself is conforming to all the regulations, having that requirement to make the seawall also conforming. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, for our seawalls, they're in place to protect us against tidal flooding. The argument is, well, by raising a seawall, we have potential rainwater that's going to be stopped up and cause issues. So we just got to keep in mind we're talking about two totally separate issues. The seawall is there to protect us from that tidal flooding, and we have other scenarios or other factors that can help us to accommodate for that rainwater. that stormwater. But we have to make sure that we're looking at them separately, and, because we're gonna handle them separately. And that's it. That's the basic gist of what we were tasked to do, and we're directed to bring this before you to see if you had any thoughts or ideas on the matter, and I'm open to any questions if you have any.
Could I see 2 slides ago? Yes. Okay. So the question I had on the next slide, it defines that potential for if installing this new seawall would potentially cost more than 20% of the value of the structure, the primary structure, then we could potentially allow it to not be required. But I was thinking the oldest homes are the most likely to exceed that number, and now you're potentially imperiling the neighbors by not requiring them raise their seawall.
The 20% isn't the cost of the seawall, it's the cost of the stormwater area to hold the rainwater that's held behind the seawall.
Right. But I'm thinking
Retention area or the rain garden or the swale,
so that you could.
that 20%.
Okay. Oh, okay. So mitigation can't exceed that. Okay.
So, and just to quantify that, it's not that it can't exceed that. If somebody, because we want to promote anybody that wants to make their property more conforming, better to handle the stormwater, whether it's tidal or from rain, we want to promote that. The 20% is a cap that we set in there that we can't require it if it exceeds that, because then it's might put an a harder burden on the property owner. If they wanted to,
Right.
they could. So that was just, as far as dealing with whether it's building code or city codes, we have, in different areas, we have these thresholds. Like, for example, a commercial building, if it's not conforming to accessibility, we can require them to make improvements that come up to 20%. But if the improvements to make it ADA compliant or accessibility, then we can't require it if it exceeds 20%, but we can require up to that 20%. So same here. If there are improvements on the property that would help mitigate those damages, not the seawall itself, but help to mitigate potential damages to the property or building, then it would be set there.
Okay. I guess my concern is with accessibility, that's specific to the property in question, but if we allow variances of seawalls, then we're potentially placing other properties at risk and even imperiling city infrastructure. I mean, if somebody's seawall is way too low and they are refusing to mitigate drainage, and we just happen to have a pump station next door, and now there's a flood that could have been avoided, it's just a lot of downstream effects. So that's my concern.
Yep, there is that. It's a two-edged sword. We want to set regulations to make things safer, make things more resilient. But typically we see it on both sides. We don't want to put too much burden on the property owner.
Yeah.
So there is usually caveats in there to allow for, if warranted, and that's what it comes down to is these conditions. How do we want these conditions, or at what point do we want to say, okay, yeah, we understand your house elevation is at 4 feet, so we're going to allow you to be lower.
Right.
Something to that effect. But yeah, ultimately, we want everything, all our seawalls to be elevated to 5 feet, because that will protect us from that tidal flooding. Case in point, earlier today, I was down in the Don Cesar neighborhood, and we have a really high tide, and the roads are flooded. But if we had our seawalls up in place and elevated to where they should be, or even if they were not exactly where they should be, but if they were up a little bit,
Yeah.
It wouldn't take a whole lot to protect it. But going forward, we have to. They say every journey starts with a single step. So over time, if we can get these taken care of, then ultimately we're protecting the whole city.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking a little bit like you on this. I'm not sure why we'd even give the variance. You know, if a seawall needs to be replaced. See, and also though, I want us to be very, very careful about putting these other criteria in, because you know, it should come down to whether the seawall needs to be replaced or not. If it needs to be replaced, it should meet the new standard. I don't want us to get into a point where we go onto the property for something else. Let's say where someone's doing a renovation, you know, of their single-story home. You know, it's within FEMA compliant or FEMA amount to do. But then someone from the city goes, well, you know, your seawalls, you got the old height, and, you know, we need to mitigate something, and, you know, unless you can come up with, you know, something that's less than 20% or whatever, you know, we're going to make you put a new you know, fix the seawall. You know, and that's like,
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
yeah, something you said there triggered that to me, like, you know, well, we shouldn't be talking about flood mitigation regarding the seawall to someone who buys, you know, or has an older property just because the seawall is at the current height. Because then that's kind of like forcing them to get a new seawall, maybe when the seawall is in good repair. It's just lower. One day it's got to be higher. So as long as the focus is only on, you know, when the seawall needs to be replaced, you have to go up and you have to meet the standard. I just want to make sure that you weren't thinking, or nobody here is thinking, that there could be a situation where we go to a home, let's say, just pick my home, for example, and, you know, I'm going to do some renovation, maybe, you know, maybe if another flood comes or whatever, and someone says, well, you know, your seawall needs, you know, unless you can do this 20% thing, we're going to make you do a new seawall. You don't envision that ever happening, right?
So it's hard to say. It just depends on lawmakers and what they want to do. I haven't seen anything like that. Right now, there's, well, I shouldn't even say right now. Right now, there's two criteria that would, in our code, that would make us take a step towards saying you have to update your seawall. And that's, so if it's in disrepair,
Right.
it's basically tidal waters are flowing through it, because what happens in that scenario, it starts eroding the dirt from behind it, and eventually that wall is just going to collapse. So that's the number one.
Yep.
The number two is if they're doing work on it. So if you're working on your seawall, if you're repairing your seawall, then you have to bring that conforming. But as far as work on the house itself, that isn't a trigger. Now, the one thing that we're proposing is with a brand-new home where everything is going to be made conforming, that we're proposing to add it into our code. With a brand-new home, yep, you're going to bring your seawall up to.
What if it's a brand-new seawall and it's only 2 years old and it just doesn't conform because it was not high enough? I mean, isn't there, I see if there's a new home, there could be a requirement that the seawall is inspected. And I think there are a lot of other things. And to be honest, I think we're sort of barking up the wrong tree. And I have a lot that I want to say about this.
Could I say my last thing? And then,
Sure,
since
yeah.
you have a lot, I only have, but it goes to what I think Member Perry said there was, if someone had just decided to sell and leave St. Pete Beach because they got flooded, and someone came in and bought that property, and that property has a fairly new seawall and cap, or new cap or whatever on it, but it's good, there's nothing wrong with it. The requirement is that I have to put a raised, an elevated home, right?
Yeah, if you're building a new home.
If you're building new,
Downland
put an
building, yep.
elevated home.
Yep.
So now, I mean, yes, a lower seawall water could come over it, but I'm living in an elevated home. So why would you force someone who's built a brand new elevated home to actually worry. I mean, because the worry isn't there. They're going to have to address the seawall if they put, if there's a pool situation or these other situations. But I think the notion of forcing someone to put a new seawall in just because they've built a new home, I don't like it. I don't think that supports the residents. I think it's just barking up the wrong tree. And so that was the second thing I had. Thank you.
I would have to imagine the logic behind that is we have a seawall height goal for specific safety reasons, safety of everyone, the city, the neighbors, the property in question, and seawalls have a service life of could be 40, 50 years. So we don't want, if there's a triggering event, we don't want that to say, okay, well, then we'll just leave this seawall alone for another 40 years and let it keep causing problems every time there's a flood. So I imagine that's why that logic exists. I kind of support that. If I've got a non-conforming seawall and I just rip my house down, and unfortunately I did my seawall 2 years ago, well, for the better of the city, it has to come up.
Yeah, I just don't see, first of all, we're saying then the seawalls, let's just take this last storm, for example, that the seawalls, would have prevented the damage. And it's just, it wouldn't. And I don't think the seawalls are going to prevent, really much in a hurricane other than, the erosion of the property. What is the seawall for? Right?
So seawall is not for storm surge. So to put it in perspective, I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, so exactly my point there. The seawall is to protect the land and to make sure that the sea and the land stay separate, right? And that there's protection there. For us, I hope we don't have another storm for another 100 years, but it was a 100-year storm. So I see us putting a requirement like this as a being a little bit trigger happy on the residents here who are, that's not cheap. Seawall's $40,000+, depending on how much waterfront you have. Just because we want it to be 5 feet, why do we want it to be 5 feet? What's the reason? So not all the streets flood on a king tide. There is a section of this town that does. So I don't like when we put these, mandates because we think it would be better for the city. That's just me. But anyway, I'm done. Unless you.
So if I can comment on that. So I just wanted to iterate, you're 100% correct. Seawalls do not protect against a storm surge. Obviously, if it's a minor storm, then we have the potential protection there. To put it in perspective, when we got the flooding from Helene, the storm waters were at 7 feet NAVD. That's North American Vertical Datum, which was roughly above sea level, so 7 feet above sea level. Our seawalls our seawall code is looking for 5 feet NAVD, or 5 feet above sea level. So we were roughly, in our areas where we have conforming seawalls, we're roughly 2 feet over that with our storm surge. Keep in mind, we got sideswiped with Helene. Wasn't a direct hit. To put it in perspective, I think Cedar Key got a 14-foot storm surge. So they're not in place for those storm surges. They're in place for the tidal flooding. Now, that being said, the logic behind setting this height is not necessarily for our lives today.
I'm not debating the new requirement of 5 feet.
Yep.
Right?
No, I just wanted to comment on the question. So part of the reason why they set that elevation is studies for whether depending on who you talk to, some people believe in sea level rise and some people think it's whatever. So no matter what your opinion is, that was part of the reason to accommodate for that potential sea level rise, so that if and when that happens, 50, 60, 70, 100 years down the road, that we've taken steps to help get to a safer point. That being said, to put it in perspective, the Broward County, they adopted a requirement, and they set the elevation similar to us at 5, the seawalls to be at 5 feet. But they took it a step further, and the county said to all the municipalities, said, oh, by the way, you have 2 years to adopt a similar code to get the seawalls to this higher elevation, in anticipation of that potential. And, you know, the saying goes, better to be prepared than sorry. You know, so to err on the side of caution. That's where the 5 feet comes from. The elevation of 5 feet was determined by somebody much smarter than me that has done studies on tidal flooding and all that. But just to give you a little bit of backstory on that.
My turn?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I wanted to tell you, I've looked at this from a little bit different perspective. One of the things I was wondering, you know, why this was on the agenda, and I went back to a meeting a while ago, and I think it was Brandon, you said our seawall codes were developed 65 years ago, most of them, the base. They've been updated for variances from 1997. And so basically the material that we are trying to create variances for is woefully out of date. And I just wonder if we aren't solving the right problem. So I thought a lot about this. You talk about vision. You know, why are we doing this? We want to have an overall sustainable, resilient community. And in October 2023, the city of St. Pete Beach had a vulnerability assessment done by Kimley Horn. I've got papers from things. This was one of their things. I don't know if we can get that displayed. This was a St. Pete Beach vulnerability assessment. Is there any way to get that displayed? How do I do that?
I'm seeing it.
It's up there.
Oh, it's up
Yeah,
there.
right.
Okay, thank you. So at that time, they were talking about, you know, things like stormwater, sewage infrastructure, things that had been really not properly maintained over the years. The seawall has fallen into that same category. So they were basically looking at the risk for the city and what a priority it should be. And I think there is some value in going back to that report and trying to isolate that vision and where are we going and why are we trying to get there. I think another thing that you mentioned, Broward, I've got that. That was in that report, and it talks about sea level rise increasingly and how do you adapt, things you should do about it. The other thing that we had back in 2022, you asked about how long does it take to do things. I don't know how many people have looked at the Uniform Resilient Shoreline Protection Model Ordinance template. But there are several things out there. There are several cities that are way ahead of us. I feel like what we're trying to do is we are trying to make a patchwork quilt work. And the whole ordinance, and I'll go into why, I think the whole thing needs to be relooked at, and maybe we need to do some interim strategies. But for the long term, we can't keep applying Band-Aids to where we are right now. So I know that there was a city commission meeting where the city commission looked at some of these things, and they asked for how to get, really, there's talk about how do we incentivize people, how do we, you know, as long as we have a 4-foot and a 5-foot and we have the sawtooth, I could argue that putting a 5-foot seawall in my yard, if my neighbors have 4 feet and all their water's coming into my yard, why are they being allowed to do that to me? So, I mean, you can look at it from the opposite angle. So we did have this at the planning board meeting, and there were 5 or more items that came out of that were supposed to happen. And I have some here from the meeting summary. We were going to get city to do post-storm evaluations. You know, how big is the problem? At least for the stormwater and the sewer system, we're getting the data. How big is the problem? How many of these things do we need to fix? How long is it going to take this city to get to a 5-foot seawall the way we're doing it? How big is the problem? Do we even know? So we're supposed to be looking at things to help us along that journey. So what I would say is that this is extremely important. Just like the sign ordinance, I think resiliency for our city has seriously got to be looked at. And I do see that happening for the stormwater and sewage system and other things, but I think we need to look at our code. So the next thing I said is that we have this sheet, and you're doing a seawall elevation worksheet, and I'll put this on for a second. There's a checklist for people so that they know what they need to get done, but you fill out this sheet for seawall, and it doesn't tell you how the data is used or what the height criteria are. What determines how high a seawall can be? I know we talk about a 5-foot minimum, but should I have 6? I mean, how does the lowest level of my existing house need to be, or my neighbor's house? Or what if there's a pool? And does there need to be a retaining wall? And if there is a retaining wall, if I've got mine at 5 and you've got yours at 4, then should you build a retaining wall because you're the one that's, you know, having the water come in, not me? So there's so many things that are unclear and not defined for the, I don't know how anybody in the city actually does a seawall because I tried to sort it all out. It's terribly confusing. So I don't know what this means, but it would be really nice if there was some way in this worksheet that we knew what calculations were being done, and I'm sure that, you know, the building department could tell us that. But there's nothing in code. There's no guidance in the code that I could find. Another thing that I looked at in terms of our current status, we have a lot of different regulations. So I looked a lot at the flood control, and I looked a lot at several of the others. I'm just putting this up here so that you'll know where I get all this stuff. I didn't make it up. And then, of course, here's our St. Pete Beach ordinance. And as I read these, they conflict with each other. So, and I will tell you this is not my area of expertise, so I could certainly be educated on a number of these things. But some of the things that I saw was like if you go to the flood control and you look at the drainage plan, it says section 106-542, single-family homes and duplexes, you're not required to submit a formal drainage plan in accordance with the other requirements. It talks about the 70% impermeability, and it talks about swales should be along the property lines to help direct the stormwater runoff. So that's perfectly reasonable. But then if you go to section 98-104, number 4, relief from seawall, bulkhead, living shoreline, whatever, it's talking about storing water on your land, accommodating the retention or detention of a 25-year, 24-hour storm. So I said, okay, that's a 25-year, 24-hour storm. So a 25-year, 24-hour storm, it talks to you about that, and basically that would mean that I have to have 9.52 inches retained on my land. But the other part of the code says I can get it in a swale and get it out of there. So this is very confusing. And the thing that was presented to us today is, you see it up here on the screen, the hardship variance does result in the property owner's unwillingness to modify the site to accommodate the 25-year. Nowhere in the code could I found it in the variance section. But I couldn't find anywhere in the code that it said you had to hold 9.4 inches or 25-year, 24-hour storm. So the code is in conflict with itself as far as I can tell. I don't know where that 25-year holding the 9 inches came from. And it really doesn't make sense. if you look at some of the other things I hear people looking at. For example, here's one that is section 9801. Bulkheads and seawalls must be designed to, and it goes on to be basically impermeable. So, okay, and I know you put this stuff in for the hydrostatic pressure relief, but if we can have things either through swales, or I've even heard talk about in some of the neighborhoods that get flooding, we're going to pump it over the seawall, then why would we have a regulation that says it can't go over the seawall, you got to hold it? It doesn't make any sense. So that was another area of confusion. Here's one. This is section 106.59. A proposed development talks about grading and how, I forget what the exact wording is, but it has to do with the fact that the grade of the yard has to be along the cap of the seawall. I've seen another place where it talks about your seawall might need to be 9 inches higher, I guess, to hold things. But basically, we have requirements that we can put this seawall in, but then we don't want to make a bathtub when it rains. So why can't we grade our lawn so that it goes to the cap of the seawall? And yet, I can't tell looking at our things. It says, talks about, and there's AE versus V zones. But it does say that in an AE zone, minor amounts of fill shall be allowed. So does that mean that I can fill my yard so that it's at the cap of the seawall? I'm not really clear. So I guess I'll get into the stuff that was given to us for this meeting. The first one talked about adding language to the code for the cap design. And I think that may be just a thing to try to consolidate words on a slide, but you couldn't just look at a cap design. It has to be, the thing that it's sitting on has to be designed to hold it. So that probably may just be a slide thing. Again, the hardship is 20%. The 20% came out of the air from everything I can tell. I cannot find a reference anywhere. And when I thought it said primary structure, I thought it meant the house. So, maybe I didn't read that carefully enough and it had to do with a retention. I don't know. It's just, I don't know where that came from, and I don't know that it makes sense. Again, this whole revised criteria of administrative relief, the minimum elevation set to 4. We've talked here briefly about if somebody just put in a seawall 2 years ago and it's 4 feet 6 inches, are they going to be required to go to 5? I don't think we want to adjust the variance that we can just arbitrarily go to 4 feet, but I do think that we may want to have some verbiage in there related to age. And as far as if somebody is building a new home, I don't think it would be unreasonable to get an assessment of the lifespan of their seawall. I don't know that you necessarily are going to mandate that they build a new one, but there should be some criteria in there so that everything shouldn't have to be a variance. It should be, clearly spelled out what it is that we want. What is the goal? How are we going to get there? And I just think that looking at the approach of coming up with new ways to do variances on the code that we have, which is based on 65-year-old code that's been band-aided and band-aided and band-aided, I just don't think that's the right approach. So I feel like we need to take a step back, get our vision, look at what we're trying to do some analysis. How many seawalls are we talking? How long is it going to take the city to get to a 5 foot? And just basically have a plan and update the code. And I'm not saying we don't have to have variances and things in the short term, because everybody can't come to a screeching halt while we modernize. But there's tons of resources out there. I even, this is from the Kimley Horn, but I thought this was interesting. So this is the 25-year, 24 rainfall, which I have no idea where that came in as a variance. But if you look at the blue, that tells you how many feet it is. And I know this is hard to see, but you can see the blue everywhere. So I just took our little island, and I said, okay, for 25-year, and our little island, see into what would be underwater. So trying to retain that, an owner's unwillingness to try to retain this, I don't understand. So that's why I feel like we're barking up the wrong tree. I don't think what we're trying to do here is figure out how to do variances. I think what we really need to do is figure out how we are going to do resiliency in this city for seawalls, and that is my point.
Yeah. I agree wholeheartedly with everything Member Perry just said. And it goes down to this, and this is key in anything that we ever attempt to do. We should ask this question every time. What is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the problem? Is it we want seawalls at 5 feet, so that's the problem we have to solve? Okay. Is it, do we need to replace seawalls that are in disrepair? Is that the problem we're trying to solve? You know, we just need to focus on the problem identification, and then we can come up with the solutions. I think the city's done that already in terms of how high they want their seawalls, how high we want them. And I don't think anyone's disagreeing. There are a lot of people that probably don't like it, you know, for whatever reason, but a 5-foot seawall seems to be reasonable. It's been the reasonable standard for a while. So that problem is solved, right? How high do we want our seawalls? What's the next question you want to ask? Well, how do we get, is the question, do we need all seawalls in this city to be 5 feet by a certain date? Can we live through some type of attrition to get them to 5 feet? Do we need to focus on a part of the city first? You know, do we need to focus on the south end of our city before we focus on the north end, based on elevations? You know, what is the problem and what is the priority for the problem? I don't think trying to stick homeowners with additional cost is the right way to go on anything, you know, unless you're going to say it's solving this specific problem, which has to happen. And I don't hear any of that or see any of that. And to Member Perry's, you know, point, there is confusion out there, and that just needs to be cleared up. I don't think there's any confusion or any disagreement about 5-foot seawall. So, how do we get to the place we want to be? So what is that place? How long do we have to get there? And then what do we need to do to put in place to get there? You know, otherwise, and this is no offense to the staff, otherwise the staff goes back and does hard work to try to solve the things that the commissioners give them and this, that, and the other. But we got to stop you guys sometimes from going down all these rabbit holes and doing all these things without, you should come back to us and ask especially the commission, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Otherwise, it's just some experiment you're having me do for no reason. And it's not going to, if you don't identify the problem correctly, you're never going to produce a solution that's the correct solution. And we do this all the time. We run down these roads coming up with all these solutions, and all they are solutions looking for a problem. So let's identify the next problem, because the first one's already been identified and solved. That's the 5 foot. So what's the next thing that we're trying to do here? And maybe that's 3 or 4 questions that need to be raised and answered. But until there's clarity on that, I don't know how we move forward. Go ahead.
Hello, Laura Canary, Community Development Director. I think it might be good to just maybe go a step backwards, because again, going back to the intent and purpose of even having a stop at the planning board, since this isn't really something that usually you all will see. So we were really looking at this to look at the variance process itself, where we weren't looking at it necessarily to see if the 5 feet should change or anything. As we know, that was changed shortly before the hurricanes, and then the hurricanes happened. And so going back to many of your points of how you would hope to maybe achieve that 5 feet over maybe a decade, 2 decades, over time you would see properties redevelop and we would achieve that. Well, the storms kind of, made all of that kind of thrown out, and so it kind of changed things in that we had.
I would disagree that the storm didn't change anything about the 5-foot requirement for the seawall.
No, what I'm saying is it changed the timing of when you would see those properties come forward.
What timing?
The timing of properties naturally redeveloping over time, whether it was a home that over time was going to be torn down and rebuilt, or it was a home that maybe it was destroyed by the hurricanes and the seawall as well. So now they're in a situation where they need to look at redoing their seawall, and they wouldn't have been in a situation to have to redo their seawall at that time had it not been for the storms.
Okay,
Do you not think that there were a lot of instances where people's seawalls were?
I think there were a few incidents of seawalls that failed.
That maybe
right?
otherwise
but it wasn't across the city, right? What it's done though, it wasn't a citywide failure of seawalls. Okay, what it has done though is really in the psyche of people has said, do we now need to move quicker to get to a 5-foot seawall across the city? And that's what the discussion.
I disagree.
Okay. I don't understand what you're trying to say then.
I disagree. I think that what I'm trying to say is that over time, when you have a goal of, say, a resiliency plan, and by 2045 we're going to hope to achieve that 90% of our seawalls are at 5 feet.
Was that our goal?
No, I'm saying that as an example. As an example, because oftentimes with a resiliency or a redevelopment plan, you'll call for whatever that goal may be, and then it'll say that over time, so as properties go one by one and redevelop, they'll be, they need to bring it up to code. They need to bring it up to code. And so over time that is achieved. What happened with the storms is that it just put us in a position where we have more properties that are being redeveloped now than we would have ever anticipated in a 2-year time period. So we have a huge number of properties that are coming forward.
But you don't have to, if your seawall is fine, you don't have to address your seawall when you're redeveloping your property. I went through all this, okay? And a lot of people have gone through all this. You can remodel your home, you can demo it to the point where it's FEMA compliant, and you don't, as long as your seawall is in good condition, whether it's at the 5-foot level or not, you don't have to address the seawall. So I hear what you're saying, but it's incorrect to say that because people are redeveloping their homes or redoing their homes, remodeling, they now have to consider their seawall. Well, no, you had to consider your seawall anyway. And if your seawall is still in good repair, you're not going to redo your seawall just because the storm, took out your home and now you had to gut it and put it back together. The premise of what you're saying is not correct, and that's why I'm bringing this up.
No, that's not what I'm saying. That you have to bring your seawall up to code. And what I'm saying is each project, we've seen a number of instances where maybe it's a conforming structure, right? Conforming post-firm, and they're looking to make improvements. Maybe they were not substantially damaged, so they're able to make the improvements, and they've posed a situation where they want to make improvements to their seawall, but they're saying that they, for whatever reason, have requested a variance because they cannot come up to the 5 feet. It does not work for their project.
And I think most of us, or at least 2 of us, clearly stated that we don't agree with variances to seawalls.
So what I'm trying to say is that we have a variance process in place. There's currently one in place. And we basically needed a process in place to, if you want to appeal the decision of the variance. So if the variance was denied and you want to appeal it, what does that process look like? And we did not have a process in place.
Doesn't it look like every other appeal process you have for variances?
No.
Why would it be different?
Ralph, can you please explain that?
Well, we have regular variances that are heard by the Board of Adjustment, and those are reviewed in court by certiorari. Then we have something called administrative variances, where Luke applies in these seawall type cases, where someone says, I want to get a variance. And we had just one fact example, helps you get to some understanding of what's happening. There was one house where the seawall needed to be replaced, but the house was here and the pool was here. And they built the house so that they didn't have to step down to the pool deck. It was right at the same level as the living room, so you walk out to the pool instead of stepping down a step or two. And so if you raise the seawall up another foot, that left nowhere for the rainwater to go, because the rainwater currently went over the existing seawall into the Gulf or through holes that would no longer be allowed. So the rainwater would have nowhere to go. It would back up into the house. So they came and Luke worked with their engineer, and they looked at rerouting the stormwater from the pool deck and accommodating it elsewhere on the property. And then, of course, you can always engineer a solution. It's just how much does that engineering solution cost to gather all that stormwater that was falling on the roof and going to the pool deck and going to the Gulf, or to the bay, but now going into a stormwater collection system that wasn't on the property because it didn't have that before. So that's where like this administrative variance request came in. They argued that it was unreasonable and a hardship to have to create this new stormwater system that cost more than the house that was there. So that's the administrative appeal process. And so then the question is, so if Luke denies that variance and the people still think, hey, I should have gotten a variance to keep my sea level at 4 feet so I didn't have flooding in my house and didn't have to spend $300,000 on a stormwater system, how would I appeal that variance? And we didn't have a way to bring it to City Council for a review, or to a Board of Adjustment and then to City Council. So that's kind of an administrative procedure that we could deal with somehow, deciding where we want those appeals to go to.
Well, to me, there's two questions. One is the process question, which you're talking about, which is if there's a need for a variance, if there's not a process, there needs to be a process. But the second side of that is, where did some of these things come from? Like having to store this 25-year, 24-hour storm. Why can't stuff go over the seawall when we're going to pump it over the seawall in some of these neighborhoods? I just feel like the rules that we're trying to get variances around need to be looked at. Because I'm not denying we need a variance process.
Let me have Luke come up and address that, but I think that has to do with water pollution in the bay.
And before, you're absolutely
Or
right.
water quality.
The whole code needs to be reopened. We need to have a very robust and comprehensive visioning and relook at, because as we know, not only are things outdated, but there are things that have changed. And I think that one of the things, all I was trying to say is that some of those longer term goals or visions, when the storms happened, it just kind of made things kind of surface faster. And when we got to this point of having a variance for a seawall in particular, and then as Ralph explained, when we were asked, okay, well, if I want to appeal this decision, what's the process? We had no process, which was, okay, until the code is opened back up, we at least need a solution in the interim so that if somebody is required to do this and is requesting a variance, that they have an option or at least a path forward of what that would look like if they want to appeal it.
I agree completely, they need a process, but some of the stuff, like you're talking about pollution, if you could put, I don't know, 8 inches of fill that would filter that, I mean, it's the same thing as when it goes through and weeps through. I mean, I just, please educate me.
So just to clarify, part of the code is looking at options. So, and I'm not sure 100% the code section that you're saying where you have to retain it or detain it. There's also an option of creating a swale to get it off the property. The primary concern for retaining or detaining the stormwater on the property is to not impact the adjacent properties. But it's perfectly acceptable to have an excess, and that's what the storm drains are for, in excess to be transmitted off the property into the street, which ultimately goes to the storm drains.
Right.
So there are options, just like I've been to your house, I know what your house is like, I don't know.
Can you explain this number 4 then, because I'm not understanding it. It's wants a variance criteria because the hardship does not result in upland property owner's unwillingness to modify the site to accommodate retention or detention of a 25-year, 24 storm. I don't understand where that came from. I mean, I know what it is, but how did that get into this variance? It's not even in the requirements that you do that, which it shouldn't be, as far as I can tell, because you're right, there are swales and there are other ways.
Yeah, so there are requirements in the code to retain that water. It's in the Florida Building Code, it's in other standards that we look at. ASCE has publications on handling stormwater.
And I looked at a lot of that, and it says that for residential, you don't have to.
So
Is this commercial then, and I'm confusing commercial and
No.
residential?
So you do. So you have to handle, and look at it like this. If you have a piece of property, our lots are very small for the most part. We have some that are bigger when you're talking about commercial, but as far as our residential lots, they're relatively small. Whether that rain is falling on the roof or on the ground itself, it's going to accumulate somewhere. And we have to, as property owners, we have to manage that storm water in some form or fashion so that it doesn't impact the adjacent properties. Now, to a certain extent, and what the 25-year, 24-hour storm is alluding to is, hey, a minimum, it should be able to handle this amount of water, whether it's just natural percolation or infiltration down into the ground, or just being retained on the property and moved off to the street to go into the stormwater, into the stormwater drains. But there are codes that require that. Now, we only see it with new construction, because if we take an existing home, then let me back up just a little bit. For example, in the building code, we have several different books that we look at. We have an existing building code. With that existing code, we don't necessarily have to bring everything conforming to the regulations. But if we touch it, so for example, if we do a driveway, then we have to make that driveway conform. But if it's not conforming, then the code says, no, we don't have to touch
This
it.
particular issue, though, has changed, because when we built our house in 2010, what did we have to hold, like 1 inch or something? It wasn't 9 inches, it was 1 inch for an hour or something. Somewhere, some things got introduced, and they're contradictory to other parts of other codes. And it doesn't even have it as a requirement, it's only mentioned as something to do with the variance. So, as I tried to put this together, the code is so broken. And I think, yes, you need a variance process, but you wouldn't need so many variances if the code was cleaned up. And I think it would be wonderful to get a group of people together, like you're talking about, getting interested parties that understand, and going through all this stuff and trying to, instead of coming up with something this specific in a variance and 20% of whatever, I mean, I feel like we're trying to make rules to get around a broken thing. And if we just fix the thing, I don't have a problem with the variance process, I just have a problem with some of the criteria you're coming up with.
So, and keep in mind too, we're not looking for excuses to circumvent the 5-foot requirement.
It's
So
nothing to do with 5 foot, we agree with 5 feet.
No, I know, but that's what this whole administrative variance is about, is people that don't want to or feel that they can't go to that 5-foot requirement.
These
So-
would not be the criteria that I would support for them not having to go to 5 feet.
So, yeah, and understand there's a
Yeah, I take
multitude
it
of different scenarios that
Well,
pop
for
up.
example, if you just did your seawall 2 years ago and it's 4.5 feet and it's in great shape, I mean, that, I think, there's a good argument that they should get a variance, but this is not it.
Okay, duly noted.
I guess that's also what I'm saying, that that scenario, anyone redone their seawall before the requirement became 5 foot, whether you like it or not, I mean, take any kind of personal bias out of this, that person should be allowed to have that 4-foot seawall until the seawall fails. Unless you're going to pay to replace it. We can't be in a position where we're forcing people to pay for things, just because we want 5 foot all around. And I go back to, what's the priority in what areas too for the 5 foot, and when do we want it? What's the timeline for that? We have none of that. So we can't create things to force people when we don't even have priorities or problems statements, listed out that we agree on, so we can make actionable plans. So, anyway, you guys are doing great work as usual. Don't take any of the frustration that I may have or anyone has. I think you guys do great work. I get frustrated when these things get further down the road and they cause problems because we haven't done the due diligence now. So it's good you bring it to us, because now you're getting to hear some feedback before you hear it from somebody else. Mm-hmm. Go back and ask go back and try to ask the other questions. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I appreciate the perspective that you had when talking about, so new homes going in, but the seawall is a year or two old. So where's the threshold where we say, nope, sorry, it's not good enough, you need to elevate it? Or is it acceptable? So you bring up a valid point, in that one scenario.
And if someone tells you it's not acceptable, you got to ask why. And my gut tells me someone's going to say, because it's got to protect us because it's not 5 foot. And then I'm going to go back and say, protect us from what? It's not going to protect us from a hurricane. It's not. So, I think there's a lot of people think
there
that
for the storm
a
surge.
5-foot seawall is going to protect you from. See, we need the storm came, so now there's an impetus to get this stuff done. No, the storm and the seawall thing are not necessarily connected. There are areas of this town that greatly need, seawall heightening as soon as possible. No one's going to deny that, but we can't mix the causal factors right here, because then we're going to come up with solutions that don't solve the problem, and it just causes hardship on people, which then causes problems in the city, et cetera, et cetera. But
And I'd also like to say that I do appreciate the work that you do, and Brandon and Laura and everybody, and I probably spend a lot of time looking at this code, and like I said, it's not my area of expertise, but I do that because I value the work that you do and your expertise, and I'm trying to take seriously the planning board role of providing valuable insight or thoughts, and so there's definitely no attempt here to take any credit away from the great work that you all do. But I do think when we have code that is in as bad a shape as this code is in, yes, you certainly need a variance process until that can be fixed. But I would like to see a plan, just like I've seen for the Public Works, where they had a huge mess that they had to deal with, and they've tried to sort it out and get. I don't see a plan for this resiliency part of our city, and I'm looking for that plan.
Have we looked at standardized code, like what Member Perry pointed out, the Uniform Resilient Shoreline Protection? Could we adopt standardized code, or does SB 180 prohibit that type of change?
I'm not sure exactly what is being referenced as far as the standardized code. So we have provisions in there, and we purposely we left some verbiage out of our seawall code to give the onus on a designer, an engineer, to be able to design it however they see fit. So to leave it open to a living shoreline, or any number of other methods to create that tidal barrier. We the 5-foot threshold has been in there, and we refined the seawall code a little bit, but we took out some verbiage in there. It was just dated. And we left it open so that an engineer could say, well, hey, we have this new product, or we have this new method. Here's our elevation. We've got that met now, and here's the other design. So we have an opportunity there for a designer or contractor that works in these areas to use their creative juices and come up with other solutions. But we just wanted to make sure we got in there the elevation to help protect the city from the tidal flooding.
Any other questions? No? Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Okay, that is the end of our discussion items. Does anyone have anything else to add? Sure.
Just the one a request, like I alluded to earlier. Again, something small. Again, I could also come in to your office. It doesn't have to be here. I just want to get a little bit smarter on where we are with sidewalks, where we're headed with the sidewalks. When I first moved here, there was a movement afoot to get wider sidewalks and including barriers between the street and sidewalks. So that, and at the same time, there was all this discussion about the walkability and the bike lanes and things like that. And I'd like to just get some more information on that, where we are, what the current standing is, where we're headed. I know with some of the projects, and whether you agree with them or not, whether they go through or not, like the trade winds and the Serato, they were supposed to conform to this new sidewalk requirement. I just want to make sure that where that I want a better understanding of where that requirement is. And then much to the same thought that I had with the signage, how long is it going to, kind of take to get our streets safe? Gulf Boulevard is mainly what I'm thinking about, but so I think you know what I'm looking for. Again, you don't have to present anything. I can come and sit down with you, whatever is easier for you guys. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Meeting adjourned.